Let's get into some broader issues. At a point in time, Reaganism, as it's being called as today, that was in place all around, and people were saying that that's the dose, that's the real medication to the global, all the afflictions, all the problems of the world. Today it seems no. Now, everything at that point in time was being handed over to the private sector. The recent bubble burst that we have all witnessed, people are reverting perhaps to the other extreme. How do you see this private-public partnership really in terms of Pakistan even?
I think we have made a huge mistake in terms of privatization. I think the government had no right and no business to privatize public assets. It has resulted in a lot of damage, and you can see it in some sectors. You can see it in power, for instance, where there has been a huge loss, where things have not been planned, where power is continuously becoming more expensive. So my take on privatization. There are two types of privatization one has to talk of in Pakistan's context. One has to do with public utilities, such as power, such as water, such as to some extent transport, the railway system, the telecommunication system. These are public utilities, and my feeling is that the government should be in the business of running these, because in the end they are providing a public service. Now you charge for that service, but it's a public service, and the government should have the ability to price those services in a way that is consistent with national policy. Now, if you hand over these services to the private sector, that ability disappears, because the private sector now will be pricing for profit. And this is not fair. It is not fair on the people of the country. One, you have taken away this asset, a very valuable asset. And in selling it, you get a one-time gain, which is wasted away by our corrupt politicians. And you have permanently transferred this asset to a private party. So that kind of privatization, if our party ever comes to power, will be out, and we will attempt to recover assets that have already been nationalized. We will do this, of course, in the fairest of possible ways. We will compensate people for whatever we then take back from them in a fair, market-adjusted way. So that part of our policy is quite clear. We are not for privatization of government utilities. I just want to give you one example. I just want to further emphasize why we're not in favor of it. Let me just take an example. Fortunately, despite the efforts of many people, the railway system has not been privatized. But let me give you an example. If the railway system, for instance, was in the private sector, had gone into the private sector, you would have lost the ability to use that system as an economic tool. What I mean by that is that, let's say there is an outlying community somewhere where the traffic it's away from the main corridors where most of the traffic is on the railway system, which is down the center of the country, Karachi to Peshawar. That's the main line, and that's where most of the traffic is. Now, if you were to hand over this asset to the private sector, there would be no incentive for this sector, the private sector, private ownership, to develop service into areas where you as the government feel that there should be a service, even if the service runs at a loss, to service the people, to perhaps provide, let's say there is an area where, a rich agricultural area potentially, where there are no farm-to-market, where there is no farm-to-market access. So the government may decide to put in a railway line to that area, which will not be a profitable railway line, but which is in the interest of the overall economy. So that's why, that's just one example, and it applies across the board to utilities. The same applies to power. You extend power somewhere, if it's in the private sector, what incentive is there for them to invest a lot of money for just a few subscribers?
But in certain major economies, such as the US, the telecom sector is in private sector.
The telecom sector went into the private sector
Yes.
In the Reagan years. I mean, it was not,
and it's performing well.
This is a question that people have to. I mean, the telecom sector is not a very good example because it has been subject to very rapid technological change, and it is not what it used to be, which was just landlines. So there could be an argument, perhaps, in terms of saying, perhaps in that sector and in that sector alone, one might see a role for the private sector. But I think otherwise, I don't see a role at all in any of the other sectors.
But there's an issue of inefficiency in public sectors.
Yes, there is inefficiency, but that's not an excuse to sell them off. Now, if there is inefficiency, they should be managed better, and this is a challenge for the government to take on and say, look, if we have agencies that we are managing, we have to do it in a competent and professional way.
So you think that the government has got a role in these sort of sectors as well?
The government must have a role in these sectors. It must, because
it doesn't then takes its attention and focus away from the real issue that the government is faced with.
Actually, this is part of the real issue. I mean, this is part of the issue of providing power. If you set aside telecom, where things have changed a lot, it's no more laying lines in the ground, and a lot of it is very, very different now. But if you take all the other aspects, if you take the rail system, if you take power, if you take water, who else is going to do it but the government? I mean, these assets are policy tools, and they should be deployed to further those policy ends. Now, if the only benefit that could come by transferring these assets to the private sector is what you say, efficiency. But I don't feel that it is justifiable to transfer these assets just because you are not able to get the maximum possible efficiency. Efficiency is something. I mean, I'm not condoning it, but I don't think that's a reason. I think there is an obligation on all governments to minimize. I mean, this is their job. They're supposed to be looking after these things, and if they're not doing it well, then they ought to be removed in the next election. But to transfer these assets to someone else and say, we can't handle it, that's not part of the game here.